And welcome to another sports update with Curran Holdman here, part of the J2C show. Now, we had some big news drop yesterday as Oregon State lost their head coach, as head coach Gary Andersen has mutually agreed to part ways from being the head coach of the Oregon State Beavers football team. And it kind of came as a surprise. We knew that he was on the hot seat, only winning one game this season so far against Portland State, and not winning a game in the Pac-12, which Pac-12 is tough this year. It really is. And for Oregon State, it's been a down year. It looked like they had some promise coming in last year where they finally beat Oregon in the Civil War game. And it looked like they had a foundation built with Gary Andersen, and they had a running game that really was taking not really taking the nation, but was really improving and becoming one of the premier running backs in Ryan Nall. And he's had a down year this year. And offensively, the Beavers have just not looked good. And defensively, at times. The first half, they usually play well in the first half defensively, but the second half, things get away with them. And so they bring in Corey Hall, who is their cornerbacks coach, and he'll be the interim head coach before they jump into the coach, or while they start searching for a head coach, I believe, as soon as possible, and hopefully we'll see who they get for the end of the year. There's a lot of coordinators that could be out there in the Pac-12, a lot of quality coaches, especially Washington. You know, that would be a funny thing. Washington quarterbacks, offensive coordinator Jonathan Smith. If you don't know Jonathan Smith he was the quarterback for the Beavers back in that 2000 season when they had Chad Ochocinco, or Chad Johnson now, back when they had Johnson, TJ Houshmandzadeh. They had that offense. They had that Fiesta Bowl winning team where I remember that game exactly, and they beat Notre Dame 41-9. And it was a team that could have competed for the national championship. They had one little slip up against Washington. And that Pac-12, I mean, you had Washington State, Oregon, and Oregon State all up there in the top 10. I mean, those were four really solid and really deep teams. And it was pretty much a battle for Washington and Oregon State in the Apple Cup. I mean, that was back when the Civil War mattered, the Apple Cup. Now, the Apple Cup this year is going to be huge. With Washington and Washington State both in the top 10, Washington moves up to 5, Washington State moves up to 8. So the Apple Cup, if Washington State, I believe Washington's going to win out. Looking at their schedule, I don't see another tough. I mean, they have Oregon, and if Herbert comes back, it's in Seattle. That's going to be a tough game for Oregon. I don't see any problems in Washington's schedule. I mean, they play Oregon and Stanford back-to-back, so those are going to be two tough games. But I think they're winnable. The way Washington's playing defensively, they held California to about 93 yards or something like that, under 100 yards. So defensively, Washington's can really well. And the offense is starting to get back going, getting things rolling again. So Washington, I don't see any problems until that November 25th game in Seattle when they host Washington State. Because Washington State, on the other hand, they went through the tough part of their season, getting that huge win over USC against Poland. And to be honest, USC hasn't looked that good. USC has looked below what they were last year. Again, offensive line injuries, that's huge. They've been hurt all season on the offensive line. But they've had enough talent. They've got Sam Darnold, who's playing well, but he's getting pressured a lot. And you saw that against Pullman, especially the big strip sack at the end of the game to win it for the Cougars. But USC hasn't just looked good. But they're still talent-wise, they're going to probably win the South. I mean, it's going to be between them and Utah, taking that South and then meeting whoever. I mean, really, the Apple Cup looks like it's going to determine who's going to win the North and possibly who could be the Pac-12 champion. I mean, Washington and Washington State, it's going to be a tough. Washington State's schedule is a little bit tougher than Washington at this point. They have California this weekend, which I don't see any problem for the Cougs. Colorado could be an interesting game, but they have them at home, so that'll be. I think they'll take care of business there. Then they have Arizona coming up. They have them on the road. Arizona could be a tricky team, but I think they'll handle their business. And then Stanford at home. That's going to be a big game. That's a game I'm going to be at. But it'll be interesting to see if Washington State can hold their schedule. And you know the term Cougat, because it's been known. So hopefully Washington State can hold out their schedule until the Apple Cup, and then everything is going to be the Apple Cup. I mean, that's going to be the big game this year for the Pac-12 and most of college football, because you could potentially have Washington. If they win out, they'll probably be a 4. I don't think they'll have enough to jump into that top 3. Maybe they could take a 3 if they win out, or at least till the Apple Cup, because right now they're at 5, and the way that this season's been going, there's been a lot of teams that have just been in and out. I mean, you had Oklahoma lose this weekend. That was a big one. Penn State, I don't see Penn State looking at their schedule. Georgia's looking really well. I mean, Georgia's been annihilating. And Penn State, for the most part, they've had one tough game against Iowa 2 weeks ago, but they're coming into their rough stretch right now because they've got Michigan next week. That's a huge game. Then they've got Ohio State, and then they also have Michigan State. And Ohio State and Michigan State are on the road, so those are 2 big games. And then they have Michigan at home. So if they can win that one, and then if they can win the next 3 games, then I'm damn sure that they're going to be a lock unless they screw something up. But if they can get through the next 3 games and win all 3 of them, then they'll probably be a sure lock for that top 4 spot, and they might even jump into the top 2 just by the rank of their schedule. So those are going to be tough games for them, but that's going to be big for them. Looking into the Big Ten standings right now, Penn State on their side, they don't play Wisconsin, which is they wouldn't play Wisconsin until they met into the Big Ten bowl game, but with Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan State all in the same side, and if they are in Michigan as well. But if Penn State can walk through the next 3 games against Michigan and then at Ohio State, at Michigan State, then that's going to be huge for them. They get a bye week, though, to go into that Michigan game. So in 2 weeks, then that's going to be beneficial to them. Prep up, because this is their tough stretch, and this is pretty much going to be their season on the line. If they can handle business, then they can take care. And I mean, Saquon Barkley has just been playing phenomenal. Other than, I mean, probably the most talented player here in college football. He's the Heisman front runner. I mean, the only other person. I mean, he's got 640 yards, 6 touchdowns. So I mean, he's been doing it though on 102 carries. So right there, over 6 yards, almost 6.5 yards a carry. That's pretty good. I mean, the only other person you could look at is Stanford's Bryce Love, who already has over 1,200 yards, and he has been just taking football by storm. But with Stanford, they're one-dimensional. So if they can stop whoever stops that running game, and they also had 2 big losses at the beginning of the season, you can't put those on Bryce Love's shoulders, but team-wise, it hurt them. It really did. They jumped back into the top 25. They're ranked 23 now. They've got some tough games. Again, they play Washington State. I believe they go back-to-back on that one. Washington and Stanford November 4th against Washington State, and then Washington, they play them November 10th. So they get those 2 teams. If they're able to pull up an upset against Washington State or Washington, that'll put them right back into the picture. So that's going to be a huge game. Huge game on the 4th, huge game on the 10th. That's going to be prime time. Washington at Stanford. That's going to be a huge game for the Huskies. So that's the only one other than the Apple Cup that I can see Washington having time. But I think Washington's going to take care of business. They took care of business last year against Stanford. And Stanford, their running game, if Washington can hold that running game at bay, then that's going to put them in a favorable spot to take care of business and then move on into the Apple Cup and see who we get for the Pac-12 championship. So that's big. But the other big news, again, I touched on it briefly earlier, but Oregon State, new head coach, Corey Hall, or interim head coach. And looking at Corey Hall, he's had a really, really good resume. He was the cornerbacks coach for Oregon State since last year. And so being a Beavers fan, the one thing that we've always had trouble with in the last, forever that I've been watching the Beavers has been our defensive backs. We get burned way too many fucking times in the backfield. We just get burned. There's you can watch. There's so many plays where we just look and there's a safety getting burned and there's a guy getting a 40-yard, 50-yard touchdown pass and the ball's just going right over his head and the receiver's wide open. We've seen that too many times. But he's been coaching up this. Now this year it's been a struggle. It's not just the cornerbacks, it's everything. Because if you don't get pressure on the quarterback, then that means that gives more times to the receivers to break loose and to get away from these cornerbacks. And when you play in the Pac-12, you're going against top-level receivers. So that makes it hard on your corners that if you don't have that defensive pressure up front, getting to the quarterback, putting pressure on him, and getting sacks, or at least pressure, that's the main thing. Pressure. If you don't get any pressure, then that means the cornerbacks have to do a lot, and it doesn't give them any time to make plays because they're going to be running, because you can't touch them, you can't really do anything to the receiver. They got to let them run their path and let them run their route. It makes it hard. So that's the big thing of Oregon State. There's a lot of things with that team, but I think Corey Hall, we'll see how he does. We really can't do anything worse the way the Beavers have been playing this year, but he has a good resume. He was the cornerbacks coach for Oregon State since last year. He was a secondary coach for Weber State in 2015 before he moved to Oregon State. Then in 2014, he was at Wisconsin as a graduate assistant in defense with Andersen. And then he was a head coach in high school for a couple of years. And in 2006 was his first coaching gig. He was at Washington State. He was a graduate assistant defense. So he knows the Pac-12. He's coached here, and he's been in the big conferences, so he knows his stuff. And I expect to see something productive with his coaching, and we'll see how he played safety for Fresno, played in the NFL. Had quite a few years in there from 1999 from 2000 to 2004. He was on the Falcons team that won the NFC South. Third round draft pick, all NFL, all rookie team. 87 career starts. So he's got that know-how in there. So we'll see how it translates into the rest of the season. But you look at this OSU team, it's been hurt, it's been beat up. And it's really just been at a part where it's not what we've seen. But Corvallis is a hard place to win. It really is. We don't have the glamour or the facilities such as Oregon in Eugene. We don't have that tradition that we can fall back on like USC. So it's a hard spot. It's kind of a farm town. But I think it's a place that if you can get something going, and then we've had success. There was that stretch where Oregon State was almost a 7-8 win team in the 2000s for most of the part. So for Oregon State though, our expectations aren't yet national championship. I think it would be stupid to say that's what we're going for right now. Because we need to build something first. We need to build a foundation. We need to get something going here. And it starts with recruitment. And I think Gary Andersen did a good job recruiting. I really did. Now, recruiting high school players, and then there's two different things. Recruiting top high school players or recruiting high school talent. But there's also the part of, can that talent pan out on the college football field? So those are where there's two different areas. So for Oregon State, they can get some talent. Now, they had a big junior college class come in the recruiting wise, and they had a pretty decent recruitment. They've got a 4-star quarterback coming in next year. So, and he's already said he's committed to Oregon State. The players that were committed to Oregon State during Gary Andersen, and after the news broke out yesterday that Andersen was, they parted ways, they still stay committed to Oregon State. So that's a good sign right there. They didn't lose players or commitments and have them go to different schools because Gary Andersen left, which is good. Now we're in that mode. Who's going to be the next coach for Oregon State? Now, there are a lot of coordinators in the Pac-12, and I kind of briefly yet, but again, one interesting one would be Jonathan Smith. He's an offensive guy. He's a quarterback. He played quarterback at Oregon State. So right there, he's known by the community. He was on one of the best teams Oregon State had in their football existence. So right there, again. So that makes a lot of sense. And he's an offensive guy. Oregon State, they need something to, and when he's had a coach, Jonathan Smith, he helped coach at Chris Peterson at Boise State and at Washington. So why not have a guy that's been underneath one of the most underrated coaches in college football, in Chris Peterson, where he brought that Boise State team to a national powerhouse. Now, regardless, it was in the Mountain West Conference and it wasn't in a big conference, but it showed up when it needed to on big games, took care of its schedule, and then showed up in big games to win. So they got to that national level, Boise State, and now he's gone to Washington, a better recruiting foundation, a better pipelines. Now they're one of the top recruiting colleges. They have been, but now Chris Peterson's able to get that talent going. And there's a reason why they're one of the top 5 teams in the college football rankings, because they're that good. And Chris Peterson has a lot to do with that, and I think that was a great hire for him. But why not get a guy that's been in that system? Now, another one that was interesting was defensive coordinator for Washington State. And he's a guy who's really brought that defense. So there's 2 ways you can look at that. But I think it would be better for Oregon State to do that. Bring in a coordinator that's had experience in top programs than to try to go out and break the bank for a big college coach, because that's not going to happen. You're not going to get that with where Oregon State is. Corvallis is a hard place to recruit, and it's a hard place to win. It really is. But that's not going to appeal to these coaches that are high prestigious college coaches, because they want to go to a spot where they know they can get good recruits. It's a favorable environment, and they know they can win because they don't want to spend and rebuild. So for Oregon State, they got to get a coach that's willing to take the challenge, try to rebuild this program to where it is winning games, being a presence in the Pac-12, competing for the Pac-12 North and Pac-12 championship, and getting bowl games. That's where Oregon State is looking for. There's not going to be that hype of Oregon State trying to be a national powerhouse, not yet. They've got to build a foundation first. That's where they need to go. And so with that, they need to start with. And so we'll see what they do in the next coming weeks. Some were their favors, but they're for their job list right now. We'll see if they actually do have kind of a search list on or a short list of who they're targeting. But I think those are names that you should look out for. That would be interesting to see. But I think Jonathan Smith makes a lot of sense for Oregon State because there's a lot of ties there. Now, if they pull the trigger on that, we'll see. We'll see if there's somebody else, a smaller school coach that's doing that. And there's also coaches like that that you see that have been taking little schools like Western Michigan or stuff like that and making them win, and very good teams, bring them back to the Pac-12, because the Pac-12 is big when you have that Civil War, Oregon State. I think those are two teams that are needed to be well or to perform well to have that Pac-12. Now, Washington State, those are more so Washington having them be really good. That helps the Pac-12. USC, at times, they can be very, very good. That's one of the most prestigious schools in the Pac-12, so having them be good is good as well. Utah, Arizona State's kind of dropped off. Utah's good in the South. There's not much in the South other than USC and Utah. Cal's struggling still. They've had some rough years. But for the Pac-12 to be big, I think Oregon State, definitely Oregon. Oregon needs to be, and they're doing well under Willie Taggart for his first year. They're doing well. They got the injury bug, so that hurts quite a bit, especially when it's one of your top players. But there's still a really solid team, a very young team that I think is going to improve in the next couple of weeks and possibly be a force to reckon with next year. So that's Oregon. They're on the right path. Willie Taggart, I think, was the right guy for the right job, and he's going to do really well because they've already cinched in the number one recruiting class. So that helps a lot when you can bring in a guy that's such a good recruiter in Willie Taggart. He was a head recruiter for Jim Harbaugh back in the Stanford days. So that helps a lot too. But for Oregon State, they need to find a guy that's, first of all, good recruiter, solid leader on the coaching staff, and it's probably going to be a young guy. I think you're going to get a young guy who wants to take that job, wants it crack at being a head coach, and especially in the Pac-12, you're in one of those Power 5 conferences that can do a lot for your resume prestige and line you up for bigger jobs down the road. But if you can bring Oregon State Beavers football back to where it was a force in the Pac-12 and teams actually were scared to play the Beavers, then you can build something and you can have your name marked in that history. So there's a lot of things that can happen for a guy who wants to take this job, and there's possibilities. But it's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be really hard, especially in a deep Pac-12. But if you can get somebody to take the reins and build that program back up, then I think that's going to be very good for Oregon State and good for the Pac-12 as well. So those are my thoughts, my opinions on what's going to happen here, but we'll see. We've got a lot of time before they make any decisions. I'm still looking on a coach's list. I mean, it's pretty soon, but I think if they pulled the trigger on Gary Andersen halfway through the season, then they've already started to look at a new coach. I don't think they pull this trigger, especially because they owed a lot of there was a lot of money. But Gary Andersen actually parted ways, and he's leaving. He's parting away those wages. So, but we'll see if they do. We'll have a little bit more information on here next week as they start their scouting, their search for a new head coach. But I'm interested to see what Corey Hall does. And maybe if he does a good job with this team, maybe that puts him into the candidacy to become the full-time head coach. We'll see what happens. He'll have the rest of the season to prove himself and see if that's something that Oregon State, and if not, then they'll probably move him back down to his spot. But to have him in this role, it's big for Oregon State, and we'll see what happens. So this has been Curran Holtman. That's your sports update.